Hi. How's everyone doing? Yeah? We have slides. Brilliant. Okay. So, thank you, firstly, very much for having me here. And thank you so much also to the Czech PyCon team for putting all of this together. It's pretty great. Can we give them a round of applause, please? It's really, really great to be here. So I'm Lilly Ryan, and this is my Twitter handle in case you would like to be friends on the internet, or say things to me, or send me your thoughts. And before I get into this, I want to give you all a heads up that I'm going to be talking about death. So I know the title of this talk and the abstract might have made that kind of obvious, but if that's not a topic that you want to hear about right now, that's cool. Just go grab a coffee, wait for the next talk, come back later. I am all about the consensual talk attendance. This is not mandatory. Okay? But for those of you who are keen to stay, let's talk about deadly bugs. Okay. I am fascinated by bugs. This is not just because I'm Australian and we live with 1 million of them and they could kill you at any moment. Although that is a big part of life. What I really love about bugs, at least in software, is that it means that you have to ask some really, really interesting questions in order to find them. In the last few years, I've become a professional what-if asker. I mean, my mother would tell you that I've been doing that since I was about 3, but, you know, professionally, I've been doing it for a little while now. And every time I start a new project, or I'm handed a new set of requirements, or I'm just struggling with something, I will always start to ask questions. I will pull out the what-ifs. If something isn't working, once I've understood what I want it to achieve, I want to understand what I don't want it to achieve. This can lead you to think of all kinds of things. Some of them are going to be completely wild and totally irrelevant. But asking this question enough could lead you to find things that you wonder why you didn't think of earlier. And hopefully you'll think of these things and then you'll catch these bugs before they go on to do something nasty. So this chunk of metal was one of my very first experiences of the power of what if. I attended university at a place called Monash University, which is in Melbourne, in Australia, where I'm from. And there is a really nice garden in the front of the department of the civil engineering, where we would go and we would drink coffee and pretend that we didn't have any essays to write or exams to study for because we were students. And in the middle of this garden, we have these huge, big, twisted chunks of metal. And these pieces of metal come from the Westgate Bridge, which is a bridge in Melbourne that was finished in 1978. And it connects the west side of the city to the east side of the city. Pretty central infrastructure backbone. And I use it all the time because I live in the west and I work in the east. But in 1970, when the bridge was under construction, it collapsed. And it killed 35 people. And some of the people that it killed were working on top of the building. And some of them were taking lunch in a portable building underneath the bridge. And some of the metal that I used to drink coffee next to fell on them and crushed them. Monash University, they bought some of these pieces and they installed them in this garden in front of the Department of Civil Engineering to remind the students who studied there of the consequences of mistakes in their work. In my view, it was a pretty dramatic way to do it, but it gets the point across, and it's something that I still remember even though I attended that university several years ago and an entire career ago. So, okay, this is a strong symbol for civil engineers, but those of us who work with software fall into a different category of engineers. And when things go wrong in our work, it's not always so easy to capture a piece of that disaster and put it in the middle of a garden for future computer science students to contemplate. They're kind of intangible things sometimes. It's hard. So I wrote this talk for you instead. I'm not going to go, I mean, this is not going to go in a garden, but hopefully it will give you something to point to and look at when you're doing your own engineering. And when I'm done talking, you will have a list of 5 things that will help you avoid the software equivalent of stuff like this. So, what does a software disaster look like? Some of you, if you formally studied computer science, you might have had a course or at least a lecture about historical cases of poorly designed software that led to disasters. Courses like this tend to focus on what they call safety-critical systems. That's usually like power plant software or railway signaling software, medical software, that kind of thing, the things that make the world run properly. These kinds of courses usually involve famous historical examples of software screw-ups like the Ferrac 25, which you may have heard of. It was a radiation treatment machine in the late 1980s for cancer patients. And software bugs inside this machine caused the patients to be delivered a dose up to 10 times what they should have been of radiation. And although a lot of them were already sick, this radiation poisoning led to a lot of their very early deaths. Courses like this often also include things like the London ambulance software dispatch disaster from 1992. So in 1992, London decided that they needed to upgrade the software that they used to decide who would get an ambulance and where they would go when an ambulance was called for. Unfortunately, this software was plagued with bugs from pretty much every single level of its construction, right from the planning through to the execution, which meant that when it went live, for 2 days in the October of 1992, ambulances simply failed to show up when they were called for. And depending on the case studies you read, this led to the deaths of anywhere between 10 to 20 people who didn't get care in time. Both of these stories have gone down in the history books as things that we really want never, ever, ever to happen again. But the problem is that outside of these introductory computer science courses, we're probably never really going to think about this stuff when we work. I mean, the London ambulance disaster was really bad. But a lot of us write websites for cleaning companies. We design bank account interfaces. We write mobile apps. And these things are really cool, but they don't control medical devices, and they don't decide who gets an ambulance when it's an emergency. If they fail to function, the companies that you've written them for might lose some money, developers might get fired, but at the end of the day, nobody's going to die because of some code. But that is not quite true. I first heard about this case in Ray Nola's excellent PyCon Italia talk about Python, locales, and writing systems. And this is what kicked off my investigation into lethal software. So, in 2007, these 2 people died because of a Unicode software localization bug. This is Emin and Ramazan Çalçoban. They were a Turkish couple in the middle of a divorce, and Emin had moved out and back with her parents. And they were having an argument over SMS, as you do. Ramazan told Emin over SMS, "You change the topic every time you get backed into a corner." It's a pretty normal thing you might say to someone when you're arguing with them. The Turkish word for being backed into a corner or trapped, which I am not going to pronounce because I don't speak Turkish and I don't want to offend anybody who does, this word uses the dotless I, which is a really common letter in Turkish. That's it. Unfortunately, Emin's mobile phone software didn't support the dotless I. So she saw it as a dotted I. And the same word for being backed into a corner, when you write it with a dotted I in Turkish, looks very different. It's quite rude, and I'm not going to say it here because this is a family-friendly conference. You can look it up later if you'd like. I've got links at the end. So when Emin received it, she was very upset by what she'd read. And she showed it to her father, and he was even more upset by what he'd read. And the family decided to call Ramazan over to the house to discuss what he had said. And when he turned up there, Emin and her sisters attacked him with knives. And in the struggle, Ramazan managed to stab Emin with one of these knives, and she bled out at the scene, waiting for an ambulance to turn up. Ramazan was arrested, and a short while later, he died by his own hand in prison. In 2009, a GPS error killed an 11-year-old boy. So this boy, whose name was Carlos Sanchez, and his mother, Alicia, they had decided that they were going to take an overnight camping trip to Death Valley in the United States. And they used GPS to find their way to the camping site. Unfortunately, this GPS was programmed using maps that were at least a couple of decades out of date by this point. And so it instructed them to go down a series of increasingly poor roads, and they ended up trapped in a collapsed animal burrow, and they got stuck. And because they had only planned it to be an overnight camping trip, they had only brought about enough food and water for 2 days. And because it was a short trip, they hadn't really told anybody precisely where they were going, or given many details. The other thing they hadn't done was, because they were thinking, okay, we'll stay overnight, they hadn't planned for the daytime conditions in Death Valley, which can get up to 50 degrees Celsius during the summer, which it was. Unfortunately for them, it was about, Death Valley is a huge park. It was about 5 days before anybody came that way and found them, by which time Carlos had died of dehydration. In July 2016, a color detection software error contributed to the death of a 40-year-old man. So Joshua Brown was driving his Tesla car down a highway in Florida, and he had Autopilot mode on. So Tesla's Autopilot feature isn't quite the same as a self-driving car in the way that you would think of a self-driving car. It's designed to detect intrusions into your line of driving and skirt around accidents and things like that. It is not the kind of replacement for you taking your hands off the wheel. You shouldn't do that. And Autopilot was configured mostly for recognizing things like the dots on the road or the back of a car or the front of a car. Mr. Brown was traveling at a road that was running perpendicular to another road where a big truck was coming along. And the camera in the car failed to detect the difference between the white of the side of the truck and the white of the sky. And it also wasn't used to recognizing the side of a vehicle. It was more used to recognizing the front and the back. So it didn't see the truck. And Mr. Brown didn't see the truck either. And because neither of them saw the truck, neither of them applied the brakes. And the car went through the side of the truck, and Mr. Brown died. So, I don't want to imply that any of these technologies are inherently dangerous. A lot more lives have been saved because SMS exists, and GPS, and Autopilot, than lives that have been lost because of them. And every single one of these cases has led to inquiries and audits and changes in the systems that caused them to try and ensure that this stuff doesn't happen again. And we can't deny that all of these deaths were completely tragic and very sad. But as programmers, why do these things matter to us, really? Nobody in any of these cases was actively writing malicious code. And the outcome might have been different if somebody had reacted differently to what they had read, or if the woman driving the GPS car had turned back when she saw the roads were getting strange instead of continuing on. Or if the driver of the Tesla car had applied the brakes earlier. But the plain fact here is that your users trust you. They believe in the work that you're doing, and they believe in the goodness of your intentions. And sometimes they pay for this belief with their lives. We write code, and so we know that software isn't perfect, and it's not magic, and we're not magicians. Code is written by human beings, like everything else. But people outside of this industry don't always think like that. And to be honest, our marketers try very, very, very hard to sell the idea that we can do magic, and we are magicians, and that the technology that we develop is going to change everybody's lives and automatically make everything better and easier. When we write software, we have to remember that our users are, in some cases, literally putting their lives in our hands, and build our software according to their expectations, and not just the expectations of whoever is hopefully paying us to build it. A developer named Bill Sora wrote this excellent article recently about how he discovered this particular fact very early on in his career. So when he was a young developer, he was working for a company that designed websites for pharmaceutical companies. And this company marketed a specific drug to teenage girls. And he was asked to make a quiz to go as part of this website. The idea being that the quiz, whatever you put into it, would ultimately recommend that you take this specific drug. And it went live, and things were going pretty well. And then news broke that this drug had been linked to depression and severe suicidal thoughts in a lot of the people who were taking it, and that one of the girls who was taking it had gone on to take her own life. And when Sora found this out, and he suddenly realized that his own sister was taking this drug. So he rang her up very quickly to let her know what he'd found out. He'd had the realization that none of us ever want to have. That some of the code that he'd written, however indirectly, even something as innocent and innocuous as a quiz, had in some way contributed to a death. Really, the main problem is that the stuff that traditional engineering courses call safety-critical systems, that's your power plant software, medical devices, public infrastructure, they are not the only safety-critical systems anymore. Everything is a safety-critical system. If you can control the lights in your house and the locks on your doors from your phone, or you can call a car from a stranger on the internet through an app, or you can order a new pair of glasses via a website. These are all things, technological things, that intertwine very closely with our everyday lives. And all of them have, in some way, if you apply this what-if thinking, the potential to end in complete disaster. What if, for example, the app that you're using to lock your doors is not secured properly, and a hacker breaks in, and then steals everything, and kills everyone in the house? What if the ride that you called from your cool ride-sharing app allows drivers who are not registered to sign up for the app, and you end up in a traffic accident? Or it uses a mapping system that directs you through a dangerous neighborhood and your car is attacked? What if the glasses that you bought online were using a form that didn't record your prescription properly, and when the glasses were made up, you put them on, you can't see properly, you trip over an obstacle and fall down the stairs? So technology is embedded into every aspect of everyday life, and we rely more and more on it for every little thing. The things that we build, even the small things, can become such a critical part of the lives of our end users that we have a responsibility to take those lives seriously. And in the process of building this stuff, as Bill Sora did for every single project he joined after he wrote that quiz, we've got to ask ourselves if building these things is the right thing for the world. This is one of my favorite quotes from Jurassic Park. This is the part where Jeff Goldblum's scientist character takes the Jurassic Park management to task for their lack of understanding of the consequences of their work. Because whether we're cloning dinosaurs or we're building a Dockerized, quantum-secured blockchain for the Internet of Things devices in the cloud, the temptation of making a cool thing with this fancy buzzword technology can sometimes blind us to the reality of what these things might entail, of whether or not what we're building is going to do something good for humanity, or whether it has the potential to be a huge disaster. Just because you can, it doesn't mean that you should. Fortunately, there is a really simple way to figure out if your app is going to cause loss or death or grief, and plan to avoid that. You have to think like an astronaut. The Canadian astronaut, Chris Hadfield, who is one of my favorite people ever. He's the guy who performed the David Bowie song on the International Space Station. He speaks very often about how astronauts are taught to think before they go out into space. Literally everything that you do in space has death as one of its outcomes. There's so much training that astronauts do, and a lot of them were test pilots before they were even astronauts, so that when your plane is plummeting to the earth and you've blacked out because of the G-force and you suddenly wake up, what you do next is down to muscle memory. You don't even have to think anymore. Astronauts take lessons from the past, and then they test and they practice, and they test and they practice, and they test and they practice, until emergencies are boring and they know what to do without even thinking about it. Hadfield calls this the power of negative thinking. And I think that he explains it best in his own words when he says that self-help gurus are always advising us to think positively and envisage success. This is about as helpful as thinking about cupcakes. Just thinking about them isn't going to help. It's more important to think about what could go wrong in a mission. Visualize failings, not success. That's what's essential to survival as an astronaut. Now, most of us are probably not going to get to go to space or be test pilots. Although, if you are, please come and find me afterwards because I want to talk to you. But we can still work like astronauts and think like astronauts. We just have to do it on land. So this is how you become a land astronaut in 5 easy steps. Firstly, ask, what if? You have to do this at every stage of the development process. You ask it when you're planning your code, ask it when you're writing your code, and ask it when you're testing. It's easy to describe what you want your code to do. It's a lot harder to describe what you don't want it to do, and there are many, many more things that you don't want it to do. For example, I want this machine to brew coffee. I don't want it to brew plain hot water. I don't want it to catch fire. I don't want it to summon the gods from the depths of the ocean. Asking what if can be as informal as sitting down with your team every so often, or just by yourself if you work solo, and putting on your astronaut helmet and doing some negative thinking brainstorming. It doesn't matter how outlandish or how unlikely these ideas are, you will come up with some really weird ones, but eventually you will discover serious edge cases. Which you might not have found any other way. Security holes, or use or abuse cases that you may not have thought of otherwise. And once you've found these cases, it is important to document them so that you can deal with them later. Which leads us to tackling your backlog. If you're tracking your work in any way, you've probably got a list of tasks somewhere that you will get around to eventually. You need to make sure that that eventually happens. Set aside an afternoon a week to fix an annoying, seemingly inconsequential bug. Bugs are great because they're really good learning opportunities for newcomers to your project, whether it's closed or it's open source. Spend some time getting them done, get them fixed. Because annoying tasks that seemingly don't matter might, in the end, have negative, disastrous consequences. I mean, if someone had taken an afternoon in 2007 to add support for the dotless I in Turkish phone systems, 2 more people might be alive. And never say never. There is always going to be someone out there who is that edge case. So make sure that you cater for them. This is why it's important to remember that your users are people, just like you. And it's easy to get frustrated when people use our software in the way that we didn't intend them to. The tech community, unfortunately, has a pretty long history of shaming the people who allow us to keep doing what we're doing. Acronyms like PEBCAC, problem exists between keyboard and chair, they've been kicking around since the 70s. That's a long time. And that means there's this ingrained belief in some parts of the technology community that the problem is never with the software, it's always with the people who are using it. But the reason that these people cause us problems, really, is it circles right back to the fact that they trust us, or they want to trust us. And they believe that we can perform miracles. So they've been sold the idea that technology will change the world, and when it doesn't perform the way that they expect it to, of course they're going to be annoyed. So when we build, we have to remember that we're building for them. And when they offer feedback, we should listen to it. A quick way to remind yourself who you're building for is to use different words for the folks who use your products. When you're working on your stuff, don't talk about users. Talk about people. If you're recording your tasks as an agile-style story, or you've got some other kind of documentation, this can be as simple as just find and replace for that one particular word. I've found it, at least personally, to be a really useful way to shift my thinking. And remember that a lot of the time, these people are going to be the person standing next to you on the train, or the guy who makes your coffee, or your parents, or your children. And that's because these people are part of our lives, and in one way or another, we need to take care of them. The best way to do that as a developer is to say no to the things that we feel are going to harm others. Bill Sora, the guy who developed the online quiz, he came to a strong realization about the power of saying no. In his article, he writes, as developers, we are often the last lines of defense against potentially dangerous and unethical practices. We are the ones who build this stuff. And if all of us take a stand and say no to building things that are dangerous or unethical, then they won't get built so easily. It's a move, admittedly, that it takes a lot of determination. Sometimes it's a move that requires a certain amount of privilege to execute. It is a move that sometimes could cost you your job. But if you're in a place where you have the ability and the strength to say no to something that you don't think is right, take that stand. Isaac Asimov, the science fiction author, he's provided us, I think, a pretty useful guide for how to say no in his famous laws of robotics. So these fictional laws governed the behavior of Asimov's advanced robots in the books. And in the books, these robots lived and worked beside humans and rode trains with us and did dangerous jobs for us and helped us with everyday tasks. And the first law of robotics is what's written here. A robot may not injure a human being or, through an action, allow a human being to come to harm. We know that our cool humanoid robot future hasn't come along yet, but our laptops and our phones and the internet, in some cases, do many things that are equivalent, and in others go far beyond anything that Asimov ever dreamed. There are apps in some places that will arrange for your laundry to be picked up from your house for you, taken care of, and returned without you even thinking about it. There is increasing amount of software in your car. There are apps that track your heart rate, and there are apps that tell you to stand up when you've been sitting down for too long. All of this software is designed to make life easier for us. None of this software has anything like ethical laws built into it. This is where, in the absence of fancy robots, we need our own guiding principles. And this isn't just a thing for fictional robots. Since ancient times, doctors have had the Hippocratic Oath to guide them in decision-making when they're dealing with their patients. So things like practice 2 things in your dealings with disease. Either help or do not harm the patient. A similar Hippocratic Oath for developers has been proposed many, many, many times in the past. But in case you feel like something to guide you, this is my suggestion for a law of software development. A developer may not build something that could injure a human being, or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Personally, this is what I keep in mind when I'm building new stuff. And for me, I feel that if something violates this principle, then I'm going to say no to building it. Asimov took his theories a little further in some stories. He started playing with the concept of a zeroth law. And that's something that implies that harm could be done. This focuses on the harm that could be done to all of humanity rather than to a specific individual. And if, as developers, we developed our own zeroth guiding principle, we wouldn't get software that spies on people. We wouldn't get software that perpetuates unfair power structures. We wouldn't get software that exploits workers. We wouldn't get software with built-in encryption backdoors. We, as coders, as developers, we're the ones who get the final say in what goes on online. And we have to use that power to save the world. I know it's a cliche, but seriously, with great power comes great responsibility. So please wield yours thoughtfully. And for anyone who missed any of these points, this is a slide that you probably want to take a picture of. This is how you become a land astronaut. Take these 5 things and go back to your work and take a good, long land astronaut look at it. So if you do these things, you will find, hopefully, that the bugs won't be able to bite quite so often. Thanks.
Thank you, Lilly. And we have some questions on slide up? Yeah. All right. Let's see.
Nope. All right.
All right. Nothing from Slido. We have a question from the audience.
Okay.
Okay, so the question is, do you have any tips on how to find edge cases? Other people reviewing your tests, maybe?
That's a good one. And actually getting other people in to do the testing is also a good one. Quite often, the people who test the code are the people who write it. If you get people in who you want to use your code to test the code, they're going to find the bugs that otherwise would be found in production. Getting a wide variety of people to test it is also a really good idea. Get somebody with low vision to test your code. Get somebody who is not very tech literate to test your code. Get somebody who's very tech literate to test your code. Testing widely is the best way to find edge cases, and it's much better to do it when you're developing rather than having these things be found in production.
Right. And the second question, what do you think about the future and security of self-driving cars?
That's a good question. After the case that I spoke about, there were a lot of reviews made of the circumstances that had led to this particular incident happening. And I know that Autopilot, again, is not the same as self-driving cars, but I think that the more that we think about these things and the more that we test for these things, the more that we can evade them. I think that self-driving cars are probably an inevitability. We just need to make sure that they are the safest they can be.
Right, that's all the time we have, so thank you, Lilly.
Thanks.